Good evening, and welcome to week 2 of the Advent devotionals that Andrew and I are preparing. Thank you for being with us this evening. Tonight we'll start with our Bible reading. Our passage comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 11, where Martha attempts to grasp who Jesus really is. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent words to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Thanks be to God. In his book, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Ross Douthat writes the following. Every argument about Christianity is at the bottom an argument about the character of Christ himself. And every interpretation of Christian faith begins with an answer to the question Jesus posed to his disciples, Who do you say that I am? Throughout history, people have wrestled with this question, and it is not an easy one because Jesus seems to be full of contradictions. Feminists applaud that he allowed women to learn and follow him, yet he never appointed one as a disciple. Liberationists applaud that he spends time with the poor and marginalized, yet when asked to make a political statement, Jesus said to give Caesar his due. He angrily threw the money changers out of the temple, yet was gentle enough to hold children on his knee and bless them. He was a wise, moral teacher who preached brotherhood, and yet made dire predictions about the coming judgment at the end of days. He continually wrestled with the Jewish religious leaders, yet said he had come to fulfill the law, not do away with it. He undermined the traditional family by identifying his followers as his brothers and sisters. And yet he also handed down strict limits on divorce. He declared that his followers should be perfect in holiness like the Father, and yet he showed mercy on the worst of sinners. One moment, his appearance overwhelmed his disciples with his glory, so that they literally lost their minds. And the next, he was the bruised and bloodied criminal hanging on the cross. This desire to grasp Jesus and contain him continued after he left the earth. The Marcionites believed that the gentle, loving Jesus of the New Testament could not possibly have anything to do with the vengeful God of the Old Testament. So they declared that the Old Testament must be about a separate God. They must be two separate documents. The Ebionites declared that since Jesus was an observant Jew, then likewise his followers must all observe Jewish customs, including the laws of circumcision and the dietary laws. This trend has continued all the way into modern times. Thomas Jefferson, a child of the Enlightenment, declared that the New Testament could not possibly be true as it was written, and so he simply cut out all of the miraculous parts and kept only the wise sayings of Jesus. In the 19th century, certain apocalyptic sects within Christianity placed heavy emphasis on the coming judgment of Christ and said that the only thing that mattered was preparing yourself for eternity, not focusing on anything in this life. In the late 19th century, the German school of higher criticism gave birth to that modern movement which says that the New Testament is not the real gospel. It consists merely of stories propagated by the winners, the church who, in conjunction with the might of Rome, forced its will upon all those who opposed it. The real gospel must lie in those marginalized voices contained in the extra-canonical text. We see these tensions exemplified in John's story. In that time, poor Jewish people told the stories of the Old Testament prophets much as later medieval English people would tell the stories of Robin Hood, or as Americans in the 1930s would glamorize certain gangsters who robbed the oppressive banks. The prophets had stood up to those in power and challenged their unjust ways. They had sided with the poor and dispossessed, and they had done miracles for them, including healing and raising the dead. It is possible, then, that Martha saw Jesus as a prophet, just as when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" their first answers were Elijah or John the Baptist. This becomes even more plausible when we realize that Martha's actions are similar to those of a woman from the Old Testament. This woman is not named other than the woman of Shunem, and her story is told in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 37. The story goes that she welcomed Elisha with hospitality whenever he passed through her area. And in fact, she even asked her husband if they could build a special room in their house just for Elisha when he visited. On one of his visits, Elisha promised that she would finally have the child that she so longed for. Sure enough, the next year she has a baby, and then a few years later, the text says that the child fell suddenly ill and died. The father was reluctant to summon the prophet, but the mother was not. Brushing aside her husband, she ran to where Elisha was staying, brushed past his servant, and demanded to speak with Elisha himself. Once in the presence of the prophet, she accused him of not keeping his word about the miraculous child. Then she refused to leave until he promised he would come back with her and heal her child. Elisha rewards her faith by indeed returning with her and raising her son from the dead. So perhaps then Martha was thinking of Jesus as a successor to Elisha. No, she did not physically go to Jesus, like that other woman, but she and her sister Mary sent messengers filled with urgency, begging him to come quickly. Unlike Elisha, however, Jesus does not respond to their urgency. Who is he then? Is he a prophet? A failed prophet? An indifferent one? Has he betrayed them by uttering fine words but not living them out? Recently, my sister and I were volunteering in our church's nursery. And I must confess, there are times when I am overwhelmed with all the young children who are in there. But my sister has a gift for working with children. And so when she and I were in there together, she gathered them up at a table and then whipped out the wonderful Play-Doh. They were so excited, so we all sat down and grabbed a color and away we went playing. And somewhere in the midst of that playing, we sang Bible songs and learned a story out of a children's Bible. I will never forget those wonderful children's faces. One little girl was taking her purple Play-Doh and sticking it on her toes like nail polish. Another little boy took a little cutter shaped like a star and one by one cut out star after star, and after each one held them up saying, "Look, I did it!" So proud, as if those stars were worthy of hanging on the Christmas tree. Other children hung back from the table just a little bit, perhaps not sure if they were welcome. And so we reassured them that yes, you are welcome too. Come, get a color, come play. Today we look around at our culture and we say that people are leaving God, that our culture is abandoning God. I don't think that's the case, however, not deep down. The writer of Ecclesiastes said that God has set eternity in men's hearts. I believe, then, that people want to know God, but that perhaps they are afraid. They want Jesus' attention. They want Jesus to look upon them, but they are afraid of what they might see in his eyes. When Jesus asks, "Who am I?" we, as the Imago Dei, must ask, "Who am I?" I remember before I met Andrew, I was single for many years, and I attended a fairly large church because they in turn had a fairly large singles group. And even though there were about 20 of us, we were still surrounded by a church filled with married people. I remember distinctly on Sunday mornings, we would sit together, our group, in order to encourage and support one another, because we would be there, our single faces, amidst a sea of happily married people. Some of them had been married most of their lives and were now raising their grandchildren in that same church. At that point in my life, I had no idea what to do with myself. What does a single person who follows God do? Deep down, I believe now, I was asking, Is there a place at your table, Lord, for me? For single people? I believed that the only chair available for me was one for missionaries. That if you were single, then you should do as Paul said and devote all that extra time you had on your hands to serving the Lord in the foreign missionary fields. And so I spent several years trying to become a missionary and failing. Is there a place for me, Lord? For a single person who wants to follow you? When we got to England, I discovered the wonderful Minster Cathedral in our city of York. Beautiful stained glass windows, lovely statues. It is, quite frankly, one of the most artistic places on earth. And there my long buried artistic desires stirred once again within me. I grew up in a wonderful church, but not one that placed a very high premium on the arts. Bare walls, plain windows, plain cross. And so as I stood there in that minster, wanting to begin expressing my artistic sense, once again the cry arose within me, is there a place for me, Lord, at your table? Is there a place for an artist? Happily, yes, the answer throughout church history has been yes. And so, as we continue through Advent and look forward to the coming of our Lord, I pray that each of us look at Jesus and answer his question, who am I? And ask ourselves, who am I in Jesus? And find the hope and the love and the peace and the joy that he offers each one of us. As we light this second candle of Advent, may Christ reveal himself to each of us. And the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. So the woman left her water vessel and went into the city and said to the men, Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it? They went out of the city and came to him. From that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. Thanks be to God.